Good evening, everyone. This is Alyssa Hooks, and I'll be responding to the part of Chapter 4 that talks about digitizing libraries. I thought that this was incredibly interesting when we started with the concept of Project Gutenberg, which introduces one of the first digital libraries that has now digitized over 30,000 works of public domain. Works of public domain being things that copyrights have expired or things that people have not just put forward on the internet and copyrighted, but instead have made them access to the general public, especially things like self-printed books or self-published authors that really just want to get their message out. Project Gutenberg does a really good job of introducing a lot of the concepts of digital libraries at the forefront, only because they've begun to establish this opportunity for people to start accessing this. Project Gutenberg still today is continuing to widen the number of different books and different forms of media that they have, and that's the interesting part of Project Gutenberg, is that they went a step further, and instead of just digitizing books, they've also moved as far as to start digitizing different files of speeches and things like that, so there's more public access. But that then leads to the concept of Google Books, which followed in the same steps as Project Gutenberg, but instead of becoming a central digital library, it has become a place in which people begin to start digitizing different concepts. But they started digitizing books with a very unclear legal status, and functionally meaning that they were digitizing things that either had not been copywritten or they could not find the copyright dates and information for, so they went ahead and digitized it anyway. Naturally, we can see where these problems lie, only because it puts people in a position to where their work is being put out on the internet specifically. I mean, it's Google. And instead of it being put out with the correct attributions, it's actually just being put out as another Google book. Yes, it was titled, and yes, there was probably an author written down, but that doesn't mean that they were given the complete and appropriate copyright information. That becomes incredibly important when we look at how Google chose what they were going to and were not going to digitize. Specifically, Google's motto became that they were going to scan now and then they would later evaluate the ownership. What this shows us is that even though Google did eventually evaluate things like ownership, it wasn't necessarily in the most effective way possible. What this does is this actually creates a lot more work for not only Google, but also for the individual authors. Specifically, when we look at Google, what it shows us is not only were they scanning something and then digitizing it and putting it up on the internet, but even after they were doing that, it still put them in a position where they may be at risk to have to take it down. What that shows us is that Google's not only spending a lot of energy, but in turn a functional amount of money trying to put up and take down multiple copies of something. But this also, in turn, frustrated a lot of authors and owners and copyright individuals. Specifically, when we look at them evaluating ownership later, that ties directly back into digitizing books with an unclear legal status. Sometimes it was books that were already public domain or were about to be public domain, but even those still have a lot of copyright ownerships that have to be recognized and granted. And even that put people in a position to where Google still may have had to take things down, which leads to the greater impact of all of this. Now, when people started digitizing libraries, the main impact was on access. They were like, people are going to have more access to different films, different books, and different medium models without having to go find the book. But now not only are we seeing a lot of paywalls behind this, Google Books is still a really good example. You can see the first 10 or so pages of something before you have to pay for access to that book. But even further than that, we've seen that digital libraries have had an impact on decreasing the amount of physical libraries that we have access to. Now, originally that doesn't seem like the worst concept since these libraries are now being digitized, but it actually continues to hinder our access. We're killing access for people on the lower end of the socioeconomic spectrum when we're doing things like decreasing people's incentives to not only keep libraries open, but also maintain the amount of publications and recent publications within certain libraries. What this does is this not only impacts people on the lower end of the socioeconomic spectrum, but it makes it substantially more difficult for physical books to be traceable. Now we all know as college students that they tell us that physical books and things like that enhance our education. But if we continue to see the convenience of things like digitized libraries, we're going to start shifting away from that concept. So overall, when we take a step back and we look at the chapter 4, we can see that digital libraries are becoming a thing of our future, and functionally our reality right now. And Project Gutenberg did a really great thing when it starts to the concept of access. Digitizing over 30,000 public domain works incentivizes people's ability to read them, because now it's a lot easier to access them. And then we see the flip side of all of this with Google Books and how they're digitizing books with unclear legal status and not worrying about copyright until after they've actually digitized and published. Both of these things show us that there are not only good and bad sides to digital libraries as a concept, but then we see that there is a negative impact when it comes to decreasing things like libraries and also people's access to these works. Because we don't always just use libraries for accessing physical books, but we also use it for things like internet access to do things like access these digital libraries. But as we see a decrease in the number of libraries, we also in turn see a decrease in the number of people accessing these digital libraries. Thank you all so much and have a great evening.